Hello and welcome to Abstract America's Operations Specialist Training Program. My name is Frank and I'm a senior consultant with Abstract America. With me today is Wilbur, who is also a senior consultant. And Wilbur is going to take us through lesson 11, of our Operations Specialist Training Program. So Wilbur, take us through.
Thank you, Frank. And so as we go to lesson 11, it's going to be a continuation of what we saw in lesson 10, where we were introduced to the concept of lists. And so today we're going to look at certain list functions, 4 of them. That is the dsum function, the daverage function, the dcount function, and the subtotal function. Now, the 3 functions, that is dsum, daverage, and dcount, are known as database, or they're classified as database functions. And from the function names, you can actually see that they bear similarity to certain arithmetic functions that we have come across in the past. That is sum, average, and count. But there is a difference because these database functions were created specifically for working with databases or lists. Yes, and so as we go on, we'll be able to see how exactly they work. So the first function we'll look at is the dsum function. And in brief, the dsum function is used to calculate the sum or the total value of certain values in a list based on a given criteria. And as I said, it's categorized as a database function. So it's used to get the sum of values in a list based on a given criteria. It's a built-in function, and so it has its own syntax that you must adhere to in order for it to return an expected value. And so the syntax is, of course, you start with the function name, that is dsum, and then it accepts 3 parameters, that is the range or the database, and then the field, and the last parameter is the criteria. Now the range or database parameter is used to specify a range of cells that you want to apply the criteria against. And then after that, we have the field parameter. And the field parameter simply specifies the column whose values are to be summed. That is, it specifies the column whose values are to be summed. And you can do this in 2 ways, either by specifying the numerical position of the column in the list or by using the column label. But when you use the column label, it must be contained in the double quotation marks. Now, you remember as we were going through lists, our lists have headers. Every column has a header, and therefore therefore that column, rather it's the column headers that we will use to extract the field whose values are to be summed. And then the third parameter is the criteria, and that is that in that parameter you just feed the function the range of cells that contain your criteria. And if all the 3 parameters are valid, that is, the range is valid or the database is valid, the field parameter is valid, and the criteria parameter is valid, then we expect dsum to return a numeric value. That is, it could be an integer or it could be a decimal. But in case one of the parameters is invalid, then the function will return an error. And it's also important to note that all the 3 parameters are required. None of them is optional. So you must specify the range, the field, and the criteria. And then the 3 database functions we look at, that is the dsum, daverage, and the dcount function, have a similar syntax, and the application of the range, field, and criteria is quite similar. And so once we have an understanding the field and the criteria for the dsum function, it will be quite easy to do the same when we get to the daverage and the dcount function. And so at this juncture, we'll head to Excel, and then actually see how dsum function works in practice. So we have here a range of cells that contains some data, and of course this is just for practice. It could be much longer than this. And so we're going to create our list from this. First thing is to insert our header, and so our header row. And so for that, we right click on the first row, then insert. Now the first column will contain the serial numbers. The second column will contain the items. The third column will contain the client names. The fourth column will contain the cost or the amount. The fifth column will contain the name of the seller, and the last column will contain the category of the item in the second column. So with that, we'll format our header a bit differently, just to ensure it stands out from the rest of the data. So we've applied here a fill or a highlight, and then we make the values bold. So we have our list. Now this list is what is where we get our range or our database. Yeah, this list is where we get this first parameter of our dsum function, the range or the database. Our fields, we have 6 possible fields. It could be serial, it could be item, client, cost, seller, or category. And remember, the field is the name or the header of the column whose values we want the dsum function to sum. Okay, it's good to remember that. And then now the third parameter we need is the criteria. And in order to get the criteria, we create another separate list. Best practice, just create another separate list. And now that list could match the whole the criteria list that we will create should have at least one of these header values. In case you want to include multiple criteria, then you could have more than one, but at the very minimum, it should have one of these. It should have one of these headers. So let's take a scenario. So let's say we want to find the sum or the total amount that was spent by this guy, Barry French. We can see him appearing twice there and here. Yeah. So let's say we want to get this sum of his expenditure, this guy. So we can see that the column in which the name is found is the column called client. And so because of that, we're going to add a column header client, which matches the column where we want to apply the criteria. And then the value underneath, you also should have at least one value. And so in this case, we want the client to match Barry French. Now, so this is just a very simple criteria. That's a very simple criteria. A very short range that contains one header and contains one entry. And so we're going to apply the dsum function. And so here we'll have, of course, to enter a function is equal to dsum, and then open the brackets. Now it actually shows you that the first parameter required is the database or the range or the list. And for that, we select our list, including the header row, and then the field. Now remember, the field is the column whose values we want to sum if the criteria matches. And so we want to sum the cost field. So for that, we can actually just say, actually write cost, but we enclose it in the double quotation marks. And then the last thing is to feed our function with the criteria. And for that, we select our criteria list, including the header and the value. Once you do that, you press enter. It gives you a total of 1,649. Now, if you actually look at what he spent, you can see, because he appears twice, this is 550 and 1,099. Of course, if you sum, you get 1,649. So we can just try to understand what the dsum function did. We have here our range of values containing all the different columns, okay? Each column, of course, signifying different types of data. And then we have here our criteria. Now, criteria says that we want to look under the in the client column and get all instances of the name Barry French. And then remember, we are saying that we are interested in summing the values in the cost column. So it's going to essentially look through all this, but then specifically go to the client field, the client column. So it will go into this column and then look for all instances of this particular client, Barry French. So get one instance here. And then we have specified that we are interested in summing the cost. So it will get this value 550. And then go back to this column, get the other instance of Barry French, which is here. And then because we also specified we're interested in getting the sum of the cost, get this value, and then there's no other instance of Barry French, so it's going to sum 550 and 1,099, and of course to give us the total of 1,649. Now, let us say we are interested in, or rather we want to apply more than one criteria. Now that could come in handy in an instance such as the following. So let's suppose we want to get the sum of the sales by a particular store that were greater than some value. So let's say we want to find the sum or the total sales by this store called DC, whose values are more than 650. Okay, so we want to find the sum or the total sales by this store called DC, whose values, or rather whose values or whose costs were more than 650. So what we just have to do is come and modify our criteria, and once we do that, the dsum function will give us the total. So we modify that. So we say that we are interested in the seller. We're interested in the seller, and the value in the seller is DC. That's one. And then two, we're interested in the cost, and the value in the cost must be greater than 650. Okay. Or we can actually start by, let's say, 650. Frank.
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah.
I don't know what's happening. Could you pause?
Go.
Okay, so we're back. So we have specified that we are interested in the seller called DC, and the cost should be greater than 650. And so we'll modify our dsum function to accommodate the two, the additional column in our criteria. And so we do that, and we have the sum or the value as 933. Now, if we actually come to our list and we identify there are 4 instances of DC, and one of them is 613, which is less, so it's not picked. 643, which is less, which is also not picked. 933, which is greater than 650, and it's picked. Then we have 650, which is not greater than 650, so it's also not picked. So that means that we are left with the total as 933. And so here we have introduced two concepts. One is how to use or how to employ multiple criteria. So in this case, you can see we actually have two criteria, the seller and the cost. And then we have seen also how to apply certain conditional statements. So for example, this means that it must be greater than 650. Of course, you may want to do the reverse, which is less than, and to do that, you'll use the less than sign. And when you do that, of course, the value changes because it picks up these two values, and of course, yeah, it adds up to 1,256. The other thing we may want to look at is, you see here we've only added one row or one entry in each column in the criteria range. You can of course have more than one entry. So let's say we also want to find Montana as well. And Montana, you also want the ones that are less than 650. And we'll need to update our criteria to include the additional columns. And you can see that it actually varies to include this. So our function is looking for both DC and Montana and less than 650. Of course, you could change this one to be greater than 650 and just work around with, or rather play around with the values depending on what you want to achieve. So in this particular scenario, it will look for all values where the seller is DC and the cost is less than 650, and then also look for all the values where the seller is Montana and the cost is greater than 650, and then get the sum of the two. So you can add as many columns into your criteria as you'd want, or you could even remove, and you could add, you know, for example, here we would want to add also the Nina vote, and of course we'll need to update our criteria to include that. Yeah, and then maybe here say we want the ones that are also greater than 650. Yeah, so you can play around with your criteria depending on what you want to achieve eventually. Something else I want us to look at this point in time is the concept of wildcards. Now, wildcards allow you to increase the scope of your search. Yes, to increase the scope of your search, and some of these things are best explained practically. So if we go to our data, we see that we have two people whose first names are Carlos. So we have Carlos Soltero and we have Carlos Dali. Now, supposing we actually want to find the total amount spent by people called Carlos. Okay, so that means that we'll need to have we'll need to use something like a wildcard, so that because we don't want to enter more than one entry here, we don't want to enter Carlos Oltero and Carlos Dali. What if we had a huge list? So we'll need to use a wildcard to specify the fact that the entries in this column begin with Carlos, and then that will be picked up by the dsum function. Now so the first thing we'll do is to change this to client, and then we are not interested in the cost. The client's name should start with Carlos, and then we'll put the asterisk character to specify that we want that beyond Carlos, anything else can be accepted. So as long as the entry begins with Carlos, then it matches. And so we will update this criteria to match that. And see, it actually updates. And so it takes the sum of Carlos Soltero, who appears twice, and Carlos Dali, who also appears twice. And if you get the sum of that, it should be able to give you this. Yeah. Let's say we can see here we also have a Carl Jackson. Yeah. So if you actually reduce that from Carlos to Carl, then that means it will match all those who are called Carlos and also the Carl Jackson as well. And of course, you do that, our value updates to include that as well. And so as we have looked at the dsum function, we have seen that it enables us to get the sum of a range or the sum of a list or the sum of a database based on certain criteria. And we have seen how to work with the three parameters that we feed to the dsum function. That is specifying the range or the database or the list, and then specifying the field that we are interested in, and we've seen how to do that, and then to specify the criteria. And in specifying the criteria, we have seen that we could actually use more than one criteria. We could have more than one entry, and we could also use wildcards. And so it's important to note that, because those are similar concepts that will come across when we go to the d count and the d average function. So we'll head back to our slides. The next function we'll look at is the d average function, and d average, just from the name average, helps us to get the mean value of a set of values. Yes, and just like the dsum function, it works on values in a list, but based on a given criteria. The syntax is, as I said, similar to the dsum function, because you need the range, you need the field, and then you need the criteria. And the meanings of these parameters are just the same as the meanings of the parameters for the dsum function. And so we'll just briefly look at it in Excel, just see how it works practically, and then we'll proceed. So we go back to the same worksheet that we were working with, and then essentially, instead of using dsum, we'll need to substitute it with the d average function. And d average does what we intend. It gets the average or the mean of values that match the criteria. And our criteria is where the client name begins with Carl. And so it gets the values for Carlos Soltero, Carlos Dali, Carlos Soltero again, Carlos Dali, and then Carl Jackson, and the other Carl Jackson. And it gets them the average. And of course, it's much quicker than having to get the average in a more traditional way, that is getting the sum of all the values and then getting the count or the number of instances and then dividing the two. Yeah. We can just play around with it briefly to see how it works. We'll go back to let's say Barry French, and when you do that, you can of course see that the average of 550 and 1099 is 824.5. We could have more than one entry, and so let's say we also want to get the average of both Barry French and Clay Rosendahl, and we'll update our criteria to include the 2, and of course it updates to get the average. So everything else that we were able to apply in the dsum function, we're also able to apply here. It's only that the end result is different, because for the dsum you get the sum or the total value of your the different items in your list, but for the d average you get the average or the mean value of the different values in your list. And so we're also able to just play around with that and see how we can fit it to the different scenarios that we come across. And so the third function we look at is the dcount function. And the dcount function is used to determine the number of cells in a list or in a database that contain numerical values and that also satisfy a certain condition or a particular condition. And so we'll go and look at the syntax. And the syntax is quite similar, although there's a small difference. And so it accepts at most 3 parameters, that is the range, which is required, the field, which is optional, and the criteria. And so it's worthwhile that we note that the field is optional. It's not mandatory for you to pass the field parameter. And if you omit the field parameter, that is, you just pass the dcount function, the range and the criteria, then it will count all the records that match the criteria. Of course, if you include the field, then it will only count the records within that particular column or that particular field. Yeah, but otherwise it returns a numeric value just like the others. Now we'll go back to Excel and explore the dcount function. So we'll write our dcount function, dcount our database or our range is the whole of this. Now we'll first of all start by including the field, and then we'll also see what the function will yield if we eliminate the field. So let's say we want to count we are interested in the seller field, and the criteria is what is specified here. Now, of course, our criteria is pointing us to the client, so we'll modify it to point us to the seller, and we are looking for the seller called Nunavut, and we delete the other one and just update this to match that. Okay, and so you can see it returns 0 because seller does not contain numerical values. Now, if we alter our criteria and include under cost, we want to count the values that are, let us say, greater than 700. And so use the greater sign and 700, and then update this to match our criteria range. Oh yes, and change this to cost. It reverts to 6. And so if we actually do a physical count where the cost is greater than 700, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And so that means that our dcount function actually works as expected. Now, if we change this to where the seller is Nunavut, but we retain our count as cost. Okay. Remember, the field parameter is the parameter where the counting will be done. Yeah. So in the case of the dsum function, the field parameter was the parameter where the summing was done. For the daverage function, the field parameter was where the averaging was done. And so in this case, dcount is also where the counting will be done, and it should point to a list with, or rather a column with numerical values. And so here we have specified that the criteria is where the seller is Nunavut. And if you actually count, Nunavut occurs seven times, yeah. So which is actually true. Now the other which the criteria that we saw, where we could have multiple criteria or multiple entries in our criteria, and so on, all those also work here. So for example, if we want to count the entries in our cost column where the seller, or rather the sellers are Nunavut and also Montana, and if we update this accordingly to include that, then you can see it's 11. So that means that there are 11 instances where the seller is both, where the seller is either Nunavut or Montana. And of course, that is true. So you can explore the function just to try and see how it fits into the criteria that you're looking for. Now, the last function we'll look at in this lesson is the subtotal function. And the subtotal is used to determine or to calculate the subtotal of the numbers in a column in a list. It is different from the, or rather its classification is different from the other three that we have seen, because the other three were database functions, but the subtotal function is classified as a math or trigonometric function. It has a different syntax from the other three. That is, the very first parameter is the method, and we'll see the different methods that are supported. The second parameter is the range. That is the range of cells to be subtotaled, or in other words, the range of cells where the method that you supply as the first parameter is to be applied. And you can actually add more than one range, but you must have at least one range. And if your parameters are valid, then subtotal will return a numeric value. Otherwise, it will return an error. Now, the methods that you can use in the first parameter of subtotal are classified into two. You have the ones that run from 1 to 11, and these are methods that will include hidden values. Now remember, you can hide values in your list. So if you want to get the subtotal while including the rows whose values have been hidden, then you'll use either method 1 to 11. And method 1 is average, 2 count, so on until variance. And on the other hand, you have the methods that ignore hidden values. Therefore, if you use these methods and you have hidden certain columns, then those columns will not be used when calculating your subtotal. So if the method that you select is 101, which signifies average, then it will get the average using every other row apart from the ones that you have hidden. And so it's just good to note that distinction. So when we are specifying the method will specify if we want to use average while including hidden values, we'll write 1. But if we want to use average but ignoring hidden values, we'll use 101. If you want to get the sum of the values in a range while including hidden values, you will use, or rather you'll enter 9. But if you want to ignore hidden values, then you'll enter 109. And so just remember this syntax: subtotal requires at least 2 parameters, that is the method, and then range. And of course, you can specify more than one range. So we'll go to Excel and just see this at work. Sorry. So still working with the list that we had. So let us say we want to get the, just the sum of all these costs. Yeah. And so down here, we will write our subtotal. And Excel will actually give you, a list of the possible values. So you don't have to memorize or cram and 41. Now let us see what would happen. Yes, Frank?
I think I lost you some time back. You could revert back to where you were introducing us to the function, the subtotal function. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. So sorry for that. So to use the subtotal function, let me just erase that. So we will start working with the subtotal function, and that is subtotal. And when you enter the first opening bracket of your function, Excel actually gives you a list of all the possible methods. And therefore, you don't have to memorize Okay, so what would happen if we decide to hide, let's say, all the entries where the seller is DC? So that means these two and these two. And to hide, we select the rows and then right click, and there's the option hide. And then we also come down here, right click and hide. Now, our subtotal still gives us the same as when we had not hidden any rows, and that is because we used the number 9, and 9 belongs to the category of subtotal methods that include hidden values. Therefore, we'll look at the method numbered 109. That is the sum, but the sum which ignores hidden values. And so let's see if we'll get the same value or if we'll have different values. So instead of that, we'll just enter subtotal, and then it's 109, and then just select the same range as the one before, and you can see that there's a difference. Okay, you can actually see that there's a difference between this and this. This is because this first value, or this first subtotal, used the sum function that includes the hidden values, whereas the second one used the sum function or the sum method that ignored hidden values. So depending on the case that you have, if you do not want certain values to interfere or to be factored in when you're getting the subtotal, then you hide and then use the category of methods that ignore hidden values. But if you'd want to include everything when getting your subtotal, then of course you will use the first column or the first category of values that of methods that include the hidden values. So you could of course just let us say we want to get the average. It is possible to do that. So use one. Yeah, and so as I said, you could explore the different subtotal functions just to see how they can be used and how they can fit into the particular use case that you will come across. And so with that, we have come to an end, having looked at the dsum, daverage, dcount, and the subtotal functions. So unless Frank, you have something to add?
I think that's enough, Wilbur. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.